Norwich, the Netherlands. In the mid-1980s, a group of NASA astronauts walked into a room to take a look at something very special for the first time. When they finally got to take a look at this thing, they were surprised by how small it was. Small compared to what it was designed to do. What these astronauts were looking at was a spacecraft. Its mission? Study the sun from its north and south poles. However, in order to do so, it had to perform a maneuver that had never been performed before. It had to leave the ecliptic plane and be put on an out of the ecliptic trajectory. Success would open up new exploration opportunities in the solar system. A lot was riding on this mission. That's why NASA sent a team of astronauts to the Netherlands during the development phase of the project to examine the spacecraft in person, especially since this team would be the one responsible for getting it into space. This team was actually a space shuttle flight crew, the crew that would put the spacecraft into space. But before we get into this historic spacecraft, let's take a look at how life originally started for it. It was the early 1970s and disco was in full swing, taking over the dance floors all around the world. We've landed on the moon just a few years earlier, and silver space-age themes were appearing on the music scene. The most famous part of this theme was the disco ball. Believe it or not, the disco ball, or mirrored ball, were first used in the 1920s, but it wasn't until disco hit the scene that they became popular, lighting up the dance floor with points of light that resembled the stars in the sky. Around that time, two agencies that actually explore the sky and stars started researching ways to explore the sun, our star, from the north and south poles. Solar activities are different at the poles than at the equator. Two agencies that were conducting this research were NASA and the European Space Agency, or ESA. They concluded that a mission of this type required two spacecraft to leave the ecliptic plane. The ecliptic plane is a virtual plane in space that contains the orbit of the Earth. Flying over the poles requires that a spacecraft leaves this plane, and leaving this plane requires a tremendous amount of energy and therefore fuel. Fuel that's practically impossible for any launched rocket or spacecraft to carry. So, the only way to get that energy without carrying that very large amount of fuel that would be required is to use the gravitational energy of one of the planets. They were thinking of Jupiter specifically because it has the highest amount of gravitational energy of all of the planets due to its size. Well, actually, due to its mass. The maneuver to make a spacecraft use the gravitational energy of a planet is called gravity assist. During the time that NASA and ESA were researching to send two spacecraft to the poles of the Sun, Pioneer 10 performed the first gravity assist maneuver around Jupiter in 1973. In 1974, Pioneer 11 also performed a gravity assist maneuver around Jupiter. The two successes gave the researchers confidence that the poles of the Sun could be reached using gravity assist around Jupiter. In 1976, the project to the poles of the Sun was approved and was called the International Solar Polar Mission. It required two spacecraft to achieve the mission. Each spacecraft flies over each pole simultaneously. The project began, and steady progress was made in the years that followed. Things were going smooth, like a 70s mirrored wall living room, but by the end of the 70s and beginning in the 80s, NASA was running into budgetary issues. Why? Partly because of the space shuttle. It was supposed to launch in 1979, but due to various design issues, including issues with the heat shield tiles, the first launch had to be pushed back. This issue caused the development cost of the space shuttle to increase. This in turn forced NASA to take money out of other projects to cover the cost. One project that was cut was the International Solar Polar Mission in 1981. This should have killed the project outright. But ESA decided to pick up and continue the project, but this time with only one spacecraft. NASA, while no longer involved in the development of the spacecraft, was involved in delivering the spacecraft to space. Ironically, the space shuttle that almost grounded the project would be responsible for making sure the project got off the ground, literally. The project was now named Odysseus, after a king and hero in Greek mythology. Shortly after, the name was changed to the final name that was given to the spacecraft, Ulysses, the Latinized version of Odysseus. In any event, all this name changing didn't help Ulysses from the next bad luck to hit the spacecraft. The spacecraft was sent from Europe to the US in 1986 for a May 12th launch. The vehicle designated for the launch was the Space Shuttle Challenger on mission STS-61F.
Go with throttle up. Roger, go with throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second.
However, in January of that same year, Shuttle Challenger was destroyed. The fact that the launch vehicle of Ulysses was destroyed, coupled with the grounding of all space shuttles and the lengthy investigation that followed, forced the mission planners to dismantle Ulysses and send it back to Europe. There it would sit for several years. It was then flown back to the US and scheduled for a launch on Space Shuttle Discovery on mission STS-41 in 1990. At 7:47 a.m. on October 6, 1990, Shuttle Discovery took to the skies with Ulysses and its upper stage in its cargo bay.
1. Ignition and liftoff of Discovery and the Ulysses spacecraft bound for the polar regions of the sun.
Roll pump ignition. Roger, roll, Discovery.
Once in space, the bay doors were opened and the process of releasing Ulysses was started. The process is automated, so once it was started, all of the custom configurations required for deployment had to be done in a timely manner. It was at this time that the mission commander, Richards, was getting a little nervous. He hadn't heard anything from mission specialist Akers, who was configuring Ulysses for launch. Akers had on several occasions missed to configure the payload in time before the deployment in the simulator. But then, at about 4 minutes before deployment, Akers was done. And when asked by the commander about the progress, Akers replied, "Never had so much time." With that statement, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. A few minutes later, Ulysses was deployed into space. The space shuttle moved away, and then after a short while, the upper stage fired and sent Ulysses on its groundbreaking voyage. In 1992, it completed its first gravity assist around Jupiter. In 1994, it passed over the North Pole of the Sun. In 1995, it passed over the South Pole of the Sun. In 1996, it crossed the tail of comet Hyakutake. In 2000 and 2001, it passed over the Sun's poles for the second time. In 2004, it crossed the tail of comet McNaught-Hartley. In 2007, it crossed the tail of comet McNaught. In 2007 and 2008, it passed over the Sun's poles for the third time. Overall, Ulysses made many, many new discoveries all along its journey. But now, it's 2008, and it's been over 17 years since Ulysses was launched on a mild morning in 1990 from Florida. The radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG, that supplied power to the spacecraft was now down to only 3% of its original strength. Mission planners tried to extend the life of Ulysses by turning off any scientific instruments that was not immediately needed. This worked for a while, but as the RTG kept generating less and less power, this wasn't enough. Now, the biggest danger that Ulysses faced was its hydrazine lines freezing. These lines carry fuel to thrusters that control the attitude of the spacecraft. If they can't work because of the frozen line, it will prevent the spacecraft from pointing its antennas precisely at Earth, and in a few days, we'll lose contact with ground control. So the heaters that kept the fuel lines warm and the transmitter themselves had the highest priority for receiving power. Even with everything turned off except for the heaters and the transmitter, it was a struggle to generate enough power in the heaters to keep the fuel from freezing. So, at some point, ESA decided to turn off the more power-hungry, high data rate X-band transmitter while the spacecraft did not need to use it. Communication was done through the much slower and less power-hungry S-band channel. But then, something unexpected happened when the mission control tried to turn back on the X-band transmitter. It wouldn't come back on after multiple attempts. The X-band transmitter was lost for good. Now, the S-band channel, which was used for telemetry data, was now being used to also transmit scientific data. So scientific data could only be collected when telemetry data was being sent to Earth. The data rate of the S-band channel is up to only 512 bits per second on a good day. At that rate, it would take more than 2 days to download a single high-resolution picture from an iPhone 13. In any event, with all of those hacks tried, including bleeding the fuel lines to prevent them from freezing, time was not on the side of Ulysses. Its current trajectory was moving it from the sun, meaning it would need to use the heater more and more. Its signal was also getting weaker as it moved further away from Earth. Solving both issues required more power that Ulysses simply didn't have anymore. On top of that, newer spacecraft like ESA's Solar Orbiter or NASA's Parker Solar Probe were actively being researched and developed. Ulysses had become the old man of solar research spacecraft. Sadly, at some point, it wasn't worth the effort to try to stretch out the life of Ulysses anymore. That point was at 5:35 p.m. Central European Summer Time on 30th June 2009. Ulysses was mostly powered down, switched off everything including the transmitter that transmitted data to Earth. However, a redundant receiver was turned on. Why did it do this? Just in case the shutdown didn't go as planned, mission planners can reestablish communication with the spacecraft and attempt to correct the issue that interfered with the proper outcome expected from the shutdown. But that's not what happened with this spacecraft. Ulysses went quietly into the night after providing almost 19 years of service to the scientific community. It's still orbiting the sun to this day. Maybe one day in the distant future, we'll recover it and put it in an orbiting space museum that honors all of the spacecraft that made living in space a normal occurrence. I'm Dex DFX, for the ones we've lost.